On my daughter's wedding day, her arrogant fiancé introduced me to his boss as a broke nobody. The smugness in his voice carried across the room as though he wanted everyone nearby to hear and laugh at my expense. The groom's confidence, however, collapsed in an instant when his boss shook my hand firmly, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Good to see you, landlord." Then he turned to Ethan with a chilling calmness and added, "We'll be discussing your future, first thing Monday." The entire room seemed to freeze. Ethan's smile disappeared, replaced by the pale, stunned look of a man who had just seen his future crumble before his eyes. Before I begin, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from. I remember standing there, pretending to sip my champagne, as though nothing extraordinary had just taken place. Guests glanced between Ethan, his boss, and me, clearly sensing they had stumbled into the middle of a story much bigger than a simple wedding reception. The weight of the silence was delicious, though I maintained my composure. Ethan, on the other hand, was already unraveling. His hand twitched nervously, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for some explanation, some way to repair the damage he had just caused himself. But there was none. The truth was, this moment had been building for months. From the very first time I met Ethan, he underestimated me. He looked at my modest house, my old car, and my simple lifestyle, and he drew conclusions. In his world, a man's value was measured by flashy possessions, expensive suits, and the size of his paycheck. By those shallow standards, I was worthless, a broke nobody, and Ethan had never bothered to look deeper. But I had looked deeper into him, behind his carefully styled hair and expensive watch, behind the well-rehearsed charm he used to impress my daughter. I saw arrogance. I saw a man who respected only those who could advance his career. A man who treated kindness as weakness and humility as failure. He was a climber, the type who stepped on others to get higher, and for some reason he had convinced himself that I was at the bottom of the ladder. I didn't correct him, not once. Every insult, every condescending remark I accepted with a calm smile. I let him believe he had me figured out, and while he boasted of his rising career, I quietly prepared a lesson that he would never forget. A lesson delivered at the exact moment it would hurt the most, his wedding day, in front of the very people whose opinions he valued above all else. The first time I met Ethan was at a dinner my daughter insisted we attend together. She wanted me to get to know the man she had chosen, the one she swore was ambitious, driven, and destined for success. I agreed, though I had my doubts. We sat down at a polished restaurant table, candles flickering between us, and I watched Ethan smooth his tie and adjust his cufflinks like he was preparing for a boardroom presentation instead of a family meal. From the start, it was obvious. He wasn't trying to impress me as a person. He was trying to evaluate me. He leaned back in his chair, smiling with that rehearsed charm, and asked casually what I did these days. When I said I was retired, his eyebrows lifted just slightly, and I caught the flicker of disdain in his eyes. "Retired?" he said, stretching the word as though it were code for useless. "That's nice. At least you have hobbies to keep you busy." His tone was smooth, but the insult dripped from it like honey off a broken jar. My daughter quickly placed her hand on his arm and tried to soften the remark. "Dad likes simple things," she said with a nervous smile, as though that would excuse his condescension. Ethan went on about his job in corporate sales, about his six-figure income, about the promotions he expected in the next year. He spoke of long hours, sacrifice, and his vision for disrupting old business models, all while slicing into his truffle risotto with a surgeon's precision. Every sentence was designed to establish his superiority. Then he looked back at me and asked if I had considered part-time consulting work, something entry-level, nothing too demanding, to keep me active. He said it like he was offering me charity, as though my very survival depended on scraps from his professional table. I said little that evening. I let him talk. I let him mistake my silence for weakness, my modesty for poverty, my patience for ignorance. The more he spoke, the clearer his character became. My daughter, bless her heart, was blinded by love. She defended his arrogance, mistaking it for confidence, mistaking his ambition for strength. But I knew. I knew I was looking at a man who judged everyone by appearances, who believed youth and money gave him the right to dismiss others. That night, as I walked out of the restaurant, I already sensed what needed to be done. Ethan thought he was clever, thought he had read me perfectly. But what he didn't realize was that I had been reading men like him my entire life, and the final chapter of his story with me would not be one he expected. It wasn't long after that dinner that Ethan's arrogance surfaced again, this time at a family gathering. My sister had invited us all over for Sunday lunch, a casual occasion meant to bring the families closer before the wedding. The table was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the comforting smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread. Yet even in such a warm setting, Ethan found ways to chip at me, subtle little jabs meant to remind everyone that he considered me beneath him. When conversation turned to careers, my nephew asked Ethan what field he was in. Ethan puffed up instantly. "Corporate sales," he said, his voice swelling with pride. "I've increased my department's numbers by nearly 40% in 3 years. That's the kind of drive companies are desperate for." His tone carried the smugness of a man convinced he was carrying the business world on his shoulders. Then, with a sideways glance at me, he added, "It's tough to explain, though. People from older generations sometimes can't grasp how fast things move now." The remark drew a few uneasy chuckles around the table, and my daughter quickly stepped in again. "Dad understands plenty," she said, but Ethan waved her off, smiling in that oily way that suggested he thought he was being charming. "No offense," he continued, looking straight at me, "but most people over 50 don't keep up. It's just reality. The future belongs to people who are hungry." I sipped my water and said nothing. My sister shot me an apologetic glance, clearly embarrassed by Ethan's bluntness, but I kept my composure. I had no intention of sparring with him there. I only observed, storing away his words like careful evidence in a case I was building. Later, when dessert was served, Ethan turned the conversation to financial discipline. He joked loudly that ordering soup at restaurants was a sign someone was on a budget, throwing a pointed look my way. A few people laughed nervously, not because the joke was funny, but because they didn't know how else to respond. My daughter's cheeks turned pink, and I could see her discomfort. She tried to change the subject, but Ethan pressed on, eager to establish dominance in a room full of people who already disliked his arrogance. That afternoon, as I drove home, I replayed his comments in my mind. Every condescending word, every dismissive gesture, every assumption he made about me. He thought he was clever. He thought he was untouchable. But what he didn't know was that every insult was fuel. He was building the fire that would eventually burn his pride to ash. I only needed patience. A few weeks after that family lunch, my daughter came to visit me at home. She arrived with Ethan, who spent most of the time pacing in my living room, talking loudly on his phone about quarterly numbers and sales strategies, as if he needed to prove his importance even within my modest walls. I let him carry on, nodding politely. I could see the impatience flicker in my daughter's eyes. When he finally wandered off into the dining room to study seating charts for the wedding, she pulled me gently toward the backyard garden. We stepped outside into the quiet air. The tomato plants I'd been tending swayed softly in the breeze, and the scent of soil and grass grounded me in a way no boardroom ever could. My daughter sat beside me on the wooden bench I had built the previous summer, her expression serious. "Dad," she said softly, "what are you planning?" I looked at her, pretending to be puzzled. "Planning? I'm just trying to be a good host to my future son-in-law." She shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "Don't do that. I know you too well. You're up to something, and it involves Ethan. You've been quiet, too quiet, ever since that dinner. And I know you, Dad. When you get quiet, it means you're watching." Her words made me smile, not because she was wrong, but because she was so perceptive. She had always been able to see through me in ways others couldn't. I sighed and took her hand, noticing how the sunlight caught her engagement ring, scattering little rainbows across the dirt. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "sometimes people need to reveal who they truly are. Ethan has shown me pieces of himself that I don't think you've seen." She frowned, clearly torn. "He's not always like that. With me, he's different, kinder." "I'm sure he is," I said, "but character isn't about how we treat people we love. It's about how we treat people when we think they're beneath us. Ethan has judged me, dismissed me, assumed he knows everything, and I want you to see it for yourself, not years later when the cost is too high." Her eyes grew shiny, and she bit her lip. "So you're testing him?" I nodded slightly. "I'm giving him the opportunity to show who he really is, and if he learns something along the way, maybe it will make him a better husband to you. But if he doesn't, at least you'll know the truth before it's too late." She sat quietly, turning the ring on her finger, the conflict written all over her face. "He's going to hate you when he finds out," she whispered. "Probably," I admitted. "The real question is whether he'll hate himself more." When my daughter finally left that evening, I walked back into my study and shut the door behind me. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to sharpen every memory. On the wall above my desk hung a collection of framed photographs and documents, none of which Ethan had ever cared to notice. There were pictures of me standing in front of newly purchased properties, holding keys to apartment complexes, and shaking hands with business partners. There were plaques from local chambers of commerce, awards from real estate associations, and even a framed front-page article from the Chicago Tribune highlighting my real estate investments years ago. For decades, I had poured myself into building something lasting. Not flashy, not loud, but solid. While men like Ethan chased fast promotions and short-lived recognition, I bought land, I built, I invested. One brick at a time, one deal at a time, I created an empire of quiet strength. The crown jewel of it all was the Harrington Towers building, an office skyscraper in downtown Chicago that housed several major corporations. Ethan's company just happened to be one of its biggest tenants. And while he strutted around bragging about his six-figure salary, a portion of every paycheck he received went directly into my accounts in the form of rent. That was the irony. The man who mocked me as a broke nobody was working in a building I owned. He depended on my decisions without ever realizing it. I didn't need to sit in meetings or chase quarterly numbers anymore. My money worked for me. I had stepped back years ago, letting younger men scramble for recognition while I enjoyed the fruits of a lifetime of sacrifice. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the photo of Harrington Towers at night, its windows glowing across the Chicago skyline. Ethan had no idea. He thought my modest house and simple clothes were signs of failure. He mistook humility for weakness, but humility is often mistaken for invisibility, and I had spent my entire life learning how to be underestimated until the moment came to strike. That was the difference between us. Ethan thought success was about being loud, about proving yourself constantly. But real success, the kind that lasts, doesn't need to scream. It speaks for itself at the right moment, and I knew that moment was coming. His arrogance had written the script. All I had to do was turn the page and let the story play out. Once I had decided on the path forward, my next steps became clear. Revenge wasn't something to be rushed. It required precision, patience, and most of all, the element of surprise. Ethan already believed he had me pegged as a failure, a relic of another time. That was my greatest weapon, so I would let him continue in that belief, feeding his arrogance until the moment came to cut him down with the truth. I began with my appearance. My old suit, the one I wore to church or the occasional family event, would not do for the occasion I had in mind. I went to a tailor downtown, a man named Armando, who had been dressing Chicago's elite for decades. He measured me carefully, not once asking unnecessary questions. I told him I needed a suit that commanded respect without screaming about wealth. Something dignified, understated, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. He brought out a charcoal gray fabric with the faintest pinstripe, and when I tried it on weeks later, I saw exactly what I wanted in the mirror. A man who looked powerful, without trying. Next came the cufflinks. I visited a jeweler and ordered a pair engraved with the logo of my real estate company. Platinum, subtle, yet gleaming enough to catch the right eyes in the right light. Walter, Ethan's boss, would know them instantly. Years earlier, he had complimented me on those very cufflinks during a gala where we'd first met. They were more than decoration. They were a symbol, a reminder of who I truly was. Finally, there was the gift. Weddings were about celebratio. And after all, and no one could accuse me of being anything less than generous. I went to my private banker and arranged for a certified check, a substantial amount that would silence any whispers of poverty. $50,000, written neatly on crisp paper, ready to be presented in front of every guest. It wasn't about showing off, it was about timing. Ethan had painted me as poor, irrelevant, and pitiful. When he saw me hand over that gift, surrounded by his colleagues, his boss, and the rest of the guests, his illusion of superiority would collapse. I prepared all of this quietly, never letting my daughter suspect the scale of what I was planning. To her, I was still the quiet retiree who tended to his garden. To Ethan, I was still the old man lucky to have a roof over his head, and that was exactly how I wanted it, because when the mask came off, when the truth stood revealed, the shock would be absolute. The rehearsal dinner was held at a hotel near the lake, the kind of place with polished marble floors and chandeliers meant to impress. The room buzzed with chatter as relatives mingled with Ethan's colleagues, everyone dressed in their finest, as though the rehearsal itself were already a grand event. I arrived early, my new suit hanging perfectly from my shoulders, my cufflinks hidden under the sleeves for now. I wasn't ready to show my hand just yet. Tonight was about observation, about letting Ethan strut one more time before the fall. Ethan spotted me from across the room, and I could see the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He had clearly hoped I would fade into the background, invisible among his polished corporate friends. Instead, I greeted everyone politely, shook hands, and carried myself with calm confidence. That seemed to unnerve him. At dinner, he made sure I was seated near his colleagues. Between bites of his steak, he leaned back in his chair and announced, "This is my future father-in-law. He's retired now, enjoys a quiet life in Evanston. Simple hobbies, simple tastes." His voice carried just enough for the table to hear, but not enough to sound overtly cruel. It was condescension dressed up as politeness. One of his co-workers smiled politely and asked me if I missed working. I smiled back and said, "Retirement can be educational. You see who people really are." Ethan laughed, a bit too loudly, and patted me on the shoulder. "That's the right attitude, Mr. Wood. Keep it light. Nothing wrong with modest living. Different generations, different expectations." His words hung in the air like perfume that had soured, drawing forced chuckles from the table. I set my fork down and looked him in the eye, letting just a trace of steel into my voice. "Be careful with judgments, Ethan. Tomorrow might bring surprises." He blinked, caught off guard, but quickly recovered, laughing again, as though I'd made a joke. "Mr. Wood, I respect that you want to give me advice, but trust me, I've never misjudged a man's potential. Character is obvious. It shows in what someone wears, how they live, what they drive." The smug certainty in his voice almost made me pity him. Almost. Around the table, his colleagues nodded politely, though I caught the flicker of discomfort in a few of their eyes. Even they could sense he was going too far. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch just long enough. Then I said quietly, "Confidence can be expensive when it's misplaced." He frowned, but before he could respond, the rehearsal resumed, saving him from his own arrogance, for the moment. After the rehearsal dinner ended and most of the guests drifted away, my daughter found me outside the hotel near the garden terrace. The night air was cool, scented with roses from the neatly trimmed bushes, but her expression was heavy with worry. She crossed her arms and stood in front of me, her eyes searching mine. "Dad," she said softly, "what are you doing?" I tilted my head, pretending innocence. "Just attending my daughter's rehearsal dinner." She shook her head firmly. "No, don't play that game with me. I saw the way you looked at Ethan tonight, and the way you spoke to him. You're planning something." I exhaled slowly, staring at the glowing hotel windows across the lawn. "Sweetheart, sometimes lessons have to be learned the hard way. You've seen how he talks to me, how he talks about people he thinks are beneath him." Her jaw tightened. "I know. Believe me, I know. But you're not just testing him, are you? You're waiting for the right moment to humiliate him." The truth of her words stung, though I chose my reply carefully. "I'm waiting for the right moment to reveal who he really is. Not just to me, but to you, to everyone." She hesitated, her voice dropping. "What if you're wrong? What if he's just nervous, trying too hard? He loves me, Dad. I see sides of him you don't." I looked at her, the woman she had become, the little girl I had once carried on my shoulders. My voice softened. "And I want you to keep seeing those sides, but you need to see the rest of him too. You need to know the truth before it's too late." Her eyes glistened in the dim light. "He'll hate you if this blows up in his face." "Probably," I admitted. "But the real question is whether he'll hate himself more for how he's acted." She bit her lip, torn between two loyalties. "I don't want to choose between you." "You don't have to," I said gently. "You just have to watch. Really watch. See how he treats people when he thinks no one important is looking. See if he respects people without titles, without money, without power. That will tell you who he is." For a long moment she was quiet, staring down at her hands. Then finally she whispered, "All right, I'll stay quiet. But Dad, please promise me this isn't just about revenge." I placed my hand on her shoulder. "It's about respect. It always has been." The day before the wedding, I woke early and drove into the city. The sky over Chicago was pale blue, the lake glittering like glass as the morning sun rose above it. I parked outside the First National Bank, the same institution I'd trusted for over 30 years, and rode the elevator up to my Banker's Corner office. Jonathan Pierce had handled my accounts for decades, and he greeted me with the same calm professionalism as always. "Morning, Mr. Wood," he said, glancing at the paperwork I had already signed. "This is a significant amount for a wedding gift. Are you sure?" I nodded without hesitation. My daughter deserves the very best start I can give her. Jonathan studied the figure again, his eyebrows lifting slightly. $75,000. Certified check? Yes, I said, and I want it presented formally in an envelope. Something that makes it clear there's no mistake about the number. He prepared the documents, and within minutes the check was in my hand. Crisp, official, a single piece of paper that would silence every assumption Ethan had ever made about me. I slipped it carefully into an envelope embossed with the bank's seal, tucking it into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. Leaving the bank, I walked down Michigan Avenue, letting the rhythm of the city fill me. People rushed past, heads down, chasing appointments and deadlines, just as I had once done. For decades I had sacrificed evenings, weekends, family dinners. I had spent nights alone in empty buildings, chasing down deals, repairing what others had abandoned. There had been times when I wondered if it was worth it, nights when the weight of debt and risk threatened to crush me. But I had pressed on, one deal at a time, one building at a time, until the empire I dreamed of stood solid beneath me. And now, all these years later, the fruits of that sacrifice would speak for themselves. Ethan believed that success meant expensive cars, flashy suits, loud declarations of power. He didn't understand that real success was quiet. It didn't shout. It simply stood unshakable, waiting for the moment it was revealed. That afternoon, I returned home and laid out everything in preparation for the big day. The charcoal suit hung pressed and ready. The platinum cufflinks gleamed softly in their velvet box, and the envelope with the certified check rested in the drawer of my desk, waiting for tomorrow. As the sun set, I sat by the window of my study, staring out at the quiet street. Tomorrow, the truth would finally step out from the shadows. Tomorrow, Ethan would learn what it really meant to underestimate a man. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect summer day brides dream about. The Chicago skyline gleamed under the sunlight, the lake sparkling like a polished jewel. I dressed slowly, fastening each button of my charcoal gray suit with deliberate care. The platinum cufflinks caught the light just so, understated but impossible to miss for anyone who knew their meaning. Sliding the envelope with the certified check into my inside pocket, I studied myself in the mirror, dignified, calm, ready. When I arrived at the hotel, the lobby buzzed with excitement. Guests in elegant attire filled the space, their laughter echoing beneath the chandeliers. I moved through the crowd quietly, shaking hands, exchanging polite greetings, blending in as the father of the bride. But inside, my pulse thrummed with anticipation. Today was not just a wedding, it was the conclusion of months of patience. Upstairs, my daughter stood in the bridal suite, radiant in her grandmother's restored wedding gown. She turned when I entered, her eyes shining with emotion. "You now look beautiful," I whispered, my voice thick with pride. She hugged me tightly, and for a moment the weight of my plan faded, replaced by the simple joy of being her father. Soon, the music swelled, and I took her arm as we prepared to walk down the aisle. The chapel filled with guests rising to their feet, eyes turning toward us as we stepped forward. My daughter's hand trembled slightly in mine, but her smile never faltered. Each step echoed with memory. The first time I held her as a baby, the first day of school, the time she fell off her bike and I ran to scoop her up. All of it led to this moment. At the altar, Ethan waited in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his expression smug but softened by the sight of my daughter. For a fleeting moment I saw genuine affection in his eyes, the same charm that had drawn her in, but beneath it lurked the same arrogance I had witnessed for months. "Who gives this woman to be married?" the officiant asked. "I do," I said clearly, placing her hand into Ethan's. My voice carried to every corner of the chapel, steady and proud. The ceremony unfolded with all the traditional dignity one would expect. Vows were exchanged, voices trembling with emotion, rings slid onto fingers, promises spoken of love and commitment. As I took my seat in the front row, I felt the envelope press lightly against my chest, a reminder of the storm still waiting on the horizon. Ethan believed today would cement his triumph, but he didn't know the final act of his education had only just begun. The ceremony concluded in a burst of applause, the officiant's words still echoing as the newlyweds shared their first kiss as husband and wife. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, smiling, snapping photos, the air buzzing with celebration. Ethan walked proudly down the aisle with my daughter on his arm, his chest puffed out as though he had just conquered the world. I followed behind them, quiet and steady, the weight of the envelope against my chest a reminder of what was coming. By the time we entered the grand banquet hall for the reception, the chandeliers blazed with golden light, and the string quartet filled the air with soft jazz. Round tables draped in linen sparkled with crystal glasses and polished silverware. Waiters weaved between the guests, carrying champagne flutes on trays. Ethan worked the room like a politician, introducing Nancy to colleagues, slapping backs, laughing a little too loudly. He wanted every person there to see him not just as a groom, but as a man on the rise. I positioned myself near the bar, quietly observing. I could see the way Ethan glanced repeatedly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, where Walter, his boss, stood with a group of board members. Ethan's eyes lit up each time, filled with that hungry ambition that blinded him to everything else. This was his moment, marrying well, impressing the boss, climbing higher. He had no idea how close he was to tumbling down. At last, Ethan gathered his courage and made his way across the room with Nancy on his arm. A small entourage of colleagues trailed after him, eager to witness the exchange. I drifted closer, timing my steps to arrive just as introductions began. "Mr. Clean," Ethan said, his voice carrying above the murmur of the room, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Anne. Ancy." His chest swelled with pride as Walter shook her hand warmly. "Congratulations, my dear," Walter said. "Ethan speaks of you often." Then Ethan gestured toward me with casual dismissal, his tone laced with the same condescension he'd used from the beginning. "And this is my father-in-law, Mr. Wood. He's retired now. Lives a simple life, modest place in Evanston. Nothing special, but a good man." The words hung in the air like smoke, drifting toward the circle of colleagues who leaned in to catch every detail. Ethan's smirk suggested he believed he had managed me perfectly, polite enough not to sound cruel, dismissive enough to establish hierarchy. Walter turned, extending his hand. His eyes dropped to my cufflinks, and in that instant his entire demeanor changed. The polite smile vanished, replaced by recognition, shock, and something sharper. "Porter," he said, his voice rising above the crowd. "Porter Wood, what in blazes are you doing here?" Around us, conversations stopped. Glasses froze mid-air. Ethan blinked, confusion spreading across his face as he tried to process what he had just heard. Ethan blinked rapidly, his confident grin evaporating. "Wait, you know him?" he asked, glancing between Walter and me, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Know him?" Walter barked, his shock turning to something sharper. "Ethan, this man is not just your father-in-law. This is Porter Wood, co-owner of Harrington Properties, the man who owns the very building our company works in. He's not unemployed. He's the reason you even have an office to go to on Monday morning." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several of Ethan's colleagues exchanged stunned glances, whispering furiously to each other. Glasses clinked as waiters froze mid-step, caught in the spectacle. The entire reception seemed to lean in, waiting for Ethan's reaction. Ethan's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. That can't be right. He never told me." Walter's glare cut him off. "He shouldn't have needed to. Respect isn't conditional on what a man earns or how flashy he looks." "You called him a nobody?" "The man you dismissed as irrelevant owns half the skyline you admire every morning on your commute." The silence was suffocating. My daughter stood at Ethan's side, her hand hovering uncertainly near his arm, torn between support and shame. She looked at me with wide eyes, the truth finally dawning, though she had always suspected more than Ethan had. I didn't know," Ethan stammered, his voice breaking. "He never said anything about owning buildings or working with you. He acted like he was retired." I finally spoke, my voice calm but cutting through the air like steel. "I acted exactly how you expected me to act, Ethan. And every time you chose arrogance over respect, you revealed who you really are." Walter's face hardened, the voice of a man accustomed to ending careers with a single sentence. "Ethan, do you have any idea what this looks like? Months of condescension toward my business partner, toward the man who helped build the very foundation of our industry, and you paraded it around like an accomplishment?" Ethan's hands trembled, his perfect tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume. "Please, Mr. Clean, it was a misunderstanding. You thought wrong," Walter snapped. "And in this business, Ethan, wrong assumptions are fatal." He paused, his words hanging like a death sentence. "We'll be having a serious conversation on Monday, but right now, consider your career on probation, if it survives at all." Murmurs erupted among Ethan's colleagues, their eyes wide with disbelief as they realized the man they once envied was crumbling before them. My daughter clutched his arm, her expression torn between pity and disappointment. Ethan swallowed hard, sweat beading at his temple, as the full weight of his arrogance settled on his shoulders. For the first time since I'd met him, he was utterly silent. The banquet hall had gone still, the tension so thick it seemed no one dared breathe. All eyes were on Ethan, the man who only moments ago had strutted with smug pride, now standing pale and trembling under the weight of his own arrogance. My daughter clutched his hand, her eyes darting between us, silently begging me to say something that would end the spectacle before it completely shattered her wedding day. I stepped forward slowly, placing a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. His eyes snapped up to mine, wide with desperation, the mask of confidence long since stripped away. He looked like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. "Mr. Wood, Porter, please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I know I was wrong. I misjudged you. I misjudged everything. But I can change. I'll do better. Don't let him ruin me." The room waited for my verdict. Walter's expression was cold, ready to cut Ethan down without hesitation. My daughter's face was etched with tears, her happiness hanging in the balance. And Ethan was a man broken by his own pride. I let the silence linger, then spoke clearly enough for every guest to hear. "Ethan, you called me a nobody because you thought my worth was measured by the size of my bank account. But here's the truth. A man's worth is measured by how he treats others, especially those he thinks can give him nothing in return." His head bowed, shame radiating from him. "You're right," he muttered. "I was wrong. I see that now." I studied him for a moment, then turned to Walter. "We've all made mistakes when we were young. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from mercy, not punishment." Walter frowned but nodded slowly, respecting my decision. "Very well," he said. "Ethan keeps his job, but under close watch. One more misstep and he's done." The relief that washed over Ethan was almost pitiful. He grabbed my hand, gripping it tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I swear I'll never make the same mistake again." I gave a faint smile and handed him and my daughter the envelope with the certified check. "Take this as my wedding gift, not because of who I am, but because of who she is. Treat her well, and maybe you'll learn what real success looks like." Around us the hall began to breathe again. Glasses were lifted, conversations resumed, though the story of what had just happened would ripple through every corner of that company for years to come. Ethan had been humbled, Nancy had seen the truth, and respect, true respect, had been restored. Before we close, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from. And remember, never judge a book by its cover, because one day you might find out the cover owns the entire story.